1400 years ago, armies of nomads swept out of the Arabian desert and conquered half the world. Today, their descendants tell an extraordinary story. They say that God sent them a prophet, Muhammad, and that God then gave them an empire.
So that little video entrance there is from a documentary by a professor, Dr. Tom Holland. And you can find it on YouTube. It's called Islam, the Untold Story. It's very controversial among Muslims particularly because it questions a lot of the basic assumptions and many of the things that I've been telling you as the accepted facts of Islam. I don't really want to go into it too much because it is controversial and I don't know enough to take a side on it. So I am pointing you towards it, and I will link it on Blackboard too if you're interested. This is not me trying to attack the foundations of Islam. I'm just trying to put all sides out there. And these are reputable scholars that investigated these things. These aren't quacks. And there are also reputable scholars who responded to some of the things in that documentary too. So anyway, let's get back to the notes here. Islamic doctrine or Islamic teaching. Now, the people who over time became the interpreters of Islamic teaching are the group known as the ulama. These were the definition of the ulama are moral and religious scholars and legal scholars who interpret the foundational text of Islam. Now, there are still ulama around today in different Muslim societies. Islam doesn't have clergy the same way necessarily that most of Christianity does. There aren't priests or pastors in the same way. Although you could argue leaders of mosque and so forth, they are specially trained. And that's what the ulama were. People trained in the teachings of Muhammad and many of the people that came after Muhammad. Now, an important document or collection of documents is something known as the hadith. So pay attention to what I say here really closely. The hadith are texts that are written down that reflect sayings of Muhammad. Okay? So things that Muhammad said or did, stories about things Muhammad said or did. These are not texts that are part of the Quran. That's what I want you to see. The Quran is a separate text. The Quran is the text that is thought to be the revelations that Muhammad gave during his lifetime. All right? The hadith are collections of sayings of Muhammad or actions of Muhammad that came after. Okay? So you see the difference between those two. The hadith is not on the same level in Muslim thought as the Quran, but it is important. And there are different hadith traditions. Okay? The word there, tradition, is very important. See the word sunnah. Sunnah means tradition. Okay? That's a word you need to know. Sunnah means tradition. So a Sunni is someone who follows the tradition. Right? And I give you the word ummah there again, which means the Muslim community. What is Sharia? Sharia is the divine law of Islam. Okay? The Sharia is the law that Muslims should live by. And those who interpret Sharia are the ulama. And Sharia is based on two main sources. The Quran, right? The revelation that God gave to Muhammad, that's according to Muslim belief. And the Hadith, which I just explained what that is. And it is ulama who interpret those things. Now, different groups within Islam follow different traditions. Okay, and I'm going to say a little bit about the two main groups within Islam and how they come about next. Over time, you do have the establishment of schools. As Muslim culture spreads, After the Arab conquest and in new places, you have the establishment of schools. These schools are called madrasas. And these are schools where young boys and young men are trained to learn Arabic if Arabic wasn't their native language, which happens over time as more people convert to Islam, or to study the text of the Quran and the Hadith traditions more closely. Okay, and often the men trained in madrasas would become scholars themselves. They would become members of the ulama. All right, you might have heard of this concept before. Pretty important concept in Islam, jihad. Jihad does come from the Arabic word, which means struggle or fight. And there is both an inward jihad and an outward jihad. There's a document on Blackboard, a Word document I have, I think it's 2 pages long, and I discuss jihad and fighting in Islam with, I just have various quotes from the Quran. Okay? So it's important for you to look at those quotes in their context. So make sure you check those out. The doctrine of jihad does appear in the Quran. The word to struggle or fight certainly does. Now, what I'm talking about here is the actual fighting, right? The physical outward fighting of Muslims against unbelievers. This phrase, slay the idolaters, appears in Surah 9. Surah is the way the chapters in the Quran when it's written down. So in Surah 9 are revelations that Muhammad received, according to Muslim thought, in the context of the war with the Meccans. And when he talks about slaying the idolaters in this context, he's talking about fighting the Meccans. Okay, but of course, in later context, it's not always the same. And these verses do hold a lot of authority when it comes to Muslim practice in the future. Now, jihad also was developed in the Hadith tradition. And jihad was used for both defensive and offensive wars in Islam in the future. But and definitely there's a religious element to it. There's no doubt about that. But, in history, most of human history, most people had no problem fighting a war for religious reasons. That's something to remember. It doesn't only have to be for religious reasons, however. And there is a duty in Islam to defend the Muslim community, the Ummah. Remember, Ummah means community, from when it's attacked. So this is the idea of defensive warfare that many groups have had over time. Okay, so the idea of you have the right to defend an attack on the Muslim community. There were 3 main functions for jihad in the Muslim community. One was to motivate Muslims to fight. I mean, this makes a lot of sense, right? If you believe in the idea of paradise associated with martyrdom as part of jihad, was from the very beginning a part of Islam. It's a strong motivation to say that if you fight in the way of God, if you strive in the way of God, dying in that fight will lead to martyrdom and paradise. And Muhammad does talk about that in the Quran. There are verses, and some of those verses I have on that sheet I told you about. He talks about basically paradise being a place where it's like an oasis in the desert, is what it's described as, where you have he uses the phrase of pretty doe-eyed women feeding you not grapes, but figs and so forth. So it definitely was, one of the functions was to motivate Muslim men to fight. Another purpose of jihad would be to legitimate the ruler's authority. Legitimate there is used as a verb. So to legitimate means make legitimate a ruler's authority. If a Muslim ruler could call a jihad, it meant he had a lot of authority, right? He's acting on behalf of God's will and calling a jihad. And third, it was to set rules for warfare. Generally speaking, there were rules set down in a jihad and how you were supposed to act. What do you do with prisoners? These type of things, okay? So this is kind of a basic overview here of jihad. Let's talk about the spread of the Arab conquest, essentially, first of all. So, when Muhammad dies, it's thought that this was the area that had basically become connected to him. After Muhammad's death, you can see a very quick expansion. So, if Muhammad died in 632 in Medina, within less than about 29 years, about 30 years, Islamic conquest, the Arab conquest, had gone to Tripoli in North Africa, to northern, what today would be northern Afghanistan, and all the way to the border of what today would be Russia, almost, really close to it. So we're talking about a very quick conquest, and of course, from the Muslim perspective, this is God's blessing on them. And notice they take this whole area here in the Middle East. Remember, I told you at the beginning, the first lecture on Muhammad, this area, this was the Persian Empire, this was the Byzantine Empire. So these territories were not, at that time, made up of primarily Muslims. So how did they approach that? They didn't force everyone there to convert to Islam, and they dealt with Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians in a certain way. So maybe I'll say more about that, but that is the Arab conquest there. Now, after Muhammad dies, Muhammad did not establish a monarchy. It's my understanding he did not have a son to establish a monarchy with. So he did. So the community chose successors. And the successor, in this case, the first successor, they were known as the Caliph. The first successor was one of Muhammad's early converts, the man Abu Bakr. You can see he only lived 2 years after Muhammad. And he was also married to one of Muhammad's daughters. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. You can look at it on the screen and see I said that backwards. Muhammad married one of Bakr's daughters. So one of Muhammad's wives was a woman named Aisha, who was one of Bakr's daughters. Okay, so there's a connection there. The next two successors were related. They were not in the early group of Muhammad's converts, but they were men who came into the Ummah later, probably after the Hijrah to Medina. But Umar and Uthman were both successors. Uthman he is portrayed here in this kind of cartoon image. Uthman is traditionally thought to be the caliph under whom the Quran was first written down. I say published there, but what I mean by that, it was written in its written form, its first written form. So, and that video I told you about with Holland talks about some of that too. So that's interesting, but this is the traditional teaching. He was also assassinated, which tells you there were already rifts among different Muslim, within the Muslim community. And this led to the major rift or split in the Muslim community. Because Uthman's next successor, of course, was Ali. And this is the same Ali who was one of Muhammad's earliest converts and his relative, his cousin, right? Ali was also married to one of Muhammad's daughters. Her name was Fatima. Fatima was one of Muhammad's daughters, and Ali married her, and this will be very significant. So, notice the years that he ruled too, okay? So, let's talk about that. By 661, they basically defeated both the Persians and the Byzantines. Now, the Byzantine Empire remained in the north, but the Islamic conquest, the Arab conquest, which spread Islam into that area, completely takes over the old Persian territories.